All right, we're back. I don't know why the stream stopped, but nevertheless, we're back. All right, so let's pick up where we got off on. We are in Mark chapter 12 now, and we're going to look at how Jesus addresses this poor widow. I think that is one of the greatest examples of leadership that probably needs to be shared over and over and over and over again, like in particularly in the American context that we're a part of. In Mark chapter 12, Jesus addresses this story, if you will. Now look at this, and it says in verse 41. When I read this, it made me think about what it would be like if Jesus sat in many American churches, like literally, like what would he say? What would he do? I think about these things all the time, and I think as American believers, we have been so conditioned to think materialistically, right? So that there are very little things that we do without a sort of a privileged perspective that allows us to think about how can we materialistically do this in a way that satisfy us aesthetically and experientially and personally and individually. Like, we can't have church, as we say it, like we can't be in a room together with other believers, experiencing God's goodness and just being, quite frankly, thankful that he is there with us. No, we need to really have, we need to have lights and things like, and I'm not coming against that. Like, I personally enjoy, I enjoyed, well presented, well produced content. I mean, like it's just a personal preference of mine. It's not in any way a requirement of any sort. Like, I don't think that one person is right or wrong because they do any of these things. So I'm not saying that a person is wrong because they have lights and all those things. But what I'm saying is we almost define an experience or maybe a protocol of things by this materialist view. And then we read in the Gospels how Jesus carried on, right? In a time where people had probably, at least the tradition, the institution had more wealth than anybody could ever imagine and handle, particularly around the times that they're living in, where they are facing so many different challenges from Rome. And Jesus comes in here and he's sitting in the back of the church, or back of the building, should I say. And crowds are coming in, dropping in their money. Many rich people put in large amounts of money, which would have been the absolute correct thing to do if you're a Jew. You definitely believe in giving, you believe in almsgiving, you believe in all those things. And you're going to do your part in making sure you fulfill your obligation, right? And then the text says, Jesus called the disciples and said to them, I tell you the truth, this poor widow has given more than other ones, because this poor widow comes in after these individuals who gave tons of money, and she just drops in 2 coins. And in verse 42, those 2 coins would have been what was called 2 leptas, all right, and or quadrants. And so this is not much money at all. And this is what he concludes by what she has done versus what the rich people have done. He says, I tell you the truth, this poor widow has given more than all the others who are making contributions, for they have a tiny part of their surplus. But she, the poor as she is, has given everything she had to live on. And by no means do we take this passage and we use it as leverage to demand that people give more than what is uncomfortable and what is necessary. But it speaks to the heart of what this woman has done in comparison to the hearts of those who were giving much, right? And we just want to, at the end of the day, you want to monitor your heart. You want to make sure that what you're doing is with the right intention and it's not simply something you're doing out of personal ego or, personal gratification. Those things won't cut it with God. It has to be a heart that is committed to the Lord and really led by God to do whatever it is that you're doing. Um, and I would encourage you to read up on how easy it is to commit idolatry in a very noble way. Like, people do it all the time. Like, they do great things for all the wrong reasons, and it ends up being idolatry, you know? And you just got to be careful with those kinds of things. You want to guard your heart and make sure your heart is in the right place, because it is possible to do the right thing for the wrong reason and it be counted against you, right? So, great stuff here, and I just wanted to call attention to that. All right, so let's go a little further. Let's see what else we have. We read through Matthew 23, and in Matthew chapter 23, we saw where Jesus was lamenting. We've read that other places. I think what I really want to do is spend the rest of my time on the Olivet Discourse, okay? In Mark chapter 13, Matthew 24, and Matthew 25. Now, I personally believe that the Olivet Discourse is one of Jesus's most misunderstood messages ever. All right, praise the Lord, Sister Neely. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened with the stream. I'm sorry, I don't know why it went out. It just went out, but that's technology. All right, but the Olivet Discourse is one of Jesus's most misunderstood teachings, because many people don't understand as much as we understand everything else Jesus preaches in context. It seems that when we get to Mark 13, Matthew 24, and we begin to read these things that Jesus is talking about, we seem to forget how to read the Bible correctly. And we also seem to forget everything that we've read up until this point about the story of Israel and how and why that does, should I say, influence. It should influence everything that we read in the Gospels. And unfortunately, we see that that's just a big hindrance. And so I encourage all the time people to just read it. Like, just go down there and just read it, please. Don't make too much of it. Don't try to, complicate it. The best thing you can do is just read the Olivet Discourse and let it say what it is saying. All right. And when we do that, it becomes very clear what Jesus is trying to say. All right, let me just go here. Look at Mark's Gospel, chapter 13, and you compare that to get a holistic view to Matthew's Gospel, chapter 24 and 25. But to me, when I read Mark's Gospel, it is very clear to me that Jesus is describing a judgment that was familiar to the nation of Israel because it has happened before. Jeremiah said the exact same thing in terms that Jesus is saying in chapter 24 of Matthew, chapter 13 of the Gospel of Mark, about Israel being overcome by their enemies and their cities and their towns and their temple being destroyed. Jesus uses the same language. I don't necessarily know why scholars, so scholars have done better with it now. I must give scholarship, the kudos that they deserve. Most modern scholars will acknowledge chapter 13, at least the first half of it, as pertaining to the literal destruction of the city of Jerusalem and its temple. But it's very clear. I want you to see this, how clear it is and how much we cannot detach what is said, the first part of it, from that which is said in the second half of the chapters. Because Jesus says, as they're leaving the temple, that one day, as they're leaving the temples, they said, "Teacher, look at all these magnificent buildings. Look at the impressive stones in the walls." And just imagine this. Imagine going to a cathedral of some sort, and you're walking in there, you're saying, "Oh my gosh, this is so beautiful. This is such a beautiful place, Jesus. Look how great the walls are, and look at the stones, and look at the relics, the stained glass, and all of the great things." And then Jesus says this, literally, "Yes, look at these great buildings, but they will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another." What do you think something like that means? It means exactly what he says. It means that these buildings are not going to be here one day. The buildings that took millions and millions of dollars, the building that has taken hours and hours of labor, years and years of building, these buildings are not going to be here. And the natural question that anyone would ask is what the disciples ask. They ask him, tell us, when will this happen? And what sign will show us that these things are about to be fulfilled? Now, I love Mark's gospel because it makes it very difficult to pull away from what Jesus is about to say in this discourse. It makes it almost impossible to pull what he says in response to that question away from the contextual reality that this is dealing with Israel's temple and the city of Jerusalem. It does not apply to America. It does not apply to Russia. It does not apply to China. It does not apply to the Pope or the Roman Catholic Church. Please, by all means, stop it, okay? That's not what this passage is talking about. And if you keep reading contextual like you've been taught to read, you'll learn that that's not what it's talking about, right? What it is talking about is the fact that Israel has not done any better at managing her idolatry than she did during the times of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and in the Babylonian captivity. And here's Jesus, the last prophet, if you will, here to remind them of what they said and to pronounce the final judgment on this nation who has not yet gotten it right. Okay, that's it. If you make anything else out of it, you're going to make Jesus a liar in history and in time. And none of what he says is going to make sense. All right. Now, I know I may be saying you. I'm talking about, you probably get this when you read. I'm sorry, I don't mean, but what I'm speaking to is when I read through passages like this, I'm thinking of a variety of ideas that come from any one of these passages. And excuse me for having that apologetic lens that I kind of view things through. But I can't help but to read things and then counter it against what we commonly think about it. Because, again, America has had, and really the West has an abundance of traditional thinking, just like the Jews did about their scriptures. And we have the same thing for our scriptures. We have this abundance of interpretive influence that guides the way we even think about what we read, right? And it takes a pure effort of diligence and discipline to dial all of that back enough to understand what is actually here, right? So now, when you look at Matthew's gospel in comparison, the same scenario is painted, but there's an extra layer of questions. The question that they ask here, then, when Jesus says all these buildings are going to be destroyed and completely demolished, they ask the question, when will this happen? What sign will signal your return and the end of the world? You see how it gets different. And I think when we hear those terms and hear that question phrased that way in Matthew's gospel, then we start thinking, okay, now we got to figure this thing out. There are layers to this. But no, it's the same question, same circumstance as Mark's gospel. It's dealing with the same era, the same time. And the word world there does not mean earth as we sometimes understand it, okay? It's not the end of the earth, okay? And so what we want to understand here is that Jesus is speaking to instances that are relevant to his own time, and to take it out of that context will cause serious problems down the line when we begin to read a little further in this passage, okay? So when Jesus uses the word world here, what is he talking about? He's talking about the end of the age, okay? The end of the age. Not the end of the earth, but the end of the age, okay? So that's important to know. All right, let's go a little further. And I'll read from Matthew's gospel since we got to get into chapter 25. But Jesus begins to tell them what's going to happen, okay? He says they're going to be deception, and I hear people all the time, from these passages, and they say, well, okay, I won't say that, but y'all get what I'm saying. Yeah, maybe you don't. Let me just say it. We hear people from these passages saying, well, there are so many false prophets and there are so many deceivers, and we're living at the end of the age. And I want to say, Yeah, but not really. Like maybe you're living at the end of whatever thing that you have going on in the world today, but that isn't Matthew 25, because Matthew 25 had a very direct and pointed contextual position in history that we can't duplicate. Now, do we see similarities in Scripture about concerning the times we're living in? Absolutely. I think that's what Solomon says what he means rather when he says there's nothing new under the sun. So yeah, in principle, nothing ever really changes, but prophetically, right? Prophetically, Jesus was speaking about a particular time in history. And so to take these passages out of its prophetic context, it will position Jesus to be a liar, okay? If you don't emphasize it, we can recognize what's happening in our world by what has happened in their world, and you propose it as if Jesus is doing something that he said he was going to do a long time ago. He's finally doing it. Brothers and sisters, that's going to get us in a lot of trouble. And skeptics are going to have a field day with us in that kind of logic, okay? I just want to make sure we are prepared and we know what it is we have to deal with, because our responsibility is to bear record to truth, right? And to share this truth as clearly and concisely as possible. And so when many people will say, well, you're being too critical. Like, why are you being so? No, we kind of have to, right? We can't really afford to not be this way. Now, Sister Neely says this, but Jesus also said, destroy this temple and I will build it in 3 days. And Jews thought he meant the building that took them 40 years. This makes it more confusing. Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. And, and I will say this. Whenever you read the Gospels and you see Jesus speaking, and Sister Neely, that's actually that's even more of a great point than I initially thought, because what we sometimes see happen let me put it this way: we would rather as Bible students in the 21st century, we'd rather have this big broad equation and big broad scope of biblical interpretation. Like, this is the rule for all time, for all people, for all circumstances, and this has to happen this way in order for, like, it's kind of like this 8 plus, or maybe should I say 1 + 2 = 3 approach to reading the Bible. But what I discovered more this year than in any other year of us reading, or even previous times reading, is that the Bible is not written as if it is a scientific or even a philosophical explanation. It's not written that way, right? The Bible is written embracing all of the cultural and contextual nuances of the people living in their time. And it actually at times assumes certain thoughts and certain ideas whenever it is written to certain things. So even like you said here, Jesus referring to himself as a temple, right, would have been easily picked up by those who knew Jesus and knew even, the way in which that body temple language is used, which, by the way, Paul takes that and runs with it in 1 Corinthians. But if you're in Jerusalem and you're looking at the temple in the way that Jesus was looking at it, and you're walking through it, that complex, as we've seen so many times before, that big complex that represents Israel's identity and their prosperity and all those different things, you would have been able to draw the distinction between his body, as he refers to it as a temple, and the literal temple that was standing right there, or sitting right there in front of you. But you're right, and it's those kinds of moments, those kinds of differences and distinctions that really requires us to be careful and to read slowly, right? to read slowly, because what we want to do is we want to make sure we are grasping every one of those small details so that we don't get left behind in the train of thought. But to me, what it says is we got to take our time. And we have to eventually, as much as we're reading, we have to eventually get down to studying. and that's the real way to get things done. All right, so good stuff. All right, so Jesus says here that there'll be wars and rumors of wars. You know how we hear of a war and we're like, okay, the end is coming. And Jesus actually says when the wars come, that's not the end. But we say the end is coming whenever we hear of a war coming up. Jesus clearly says here, things must take place, but the end won't happen immediately. You know, that's not when it will. You know, nation against nation. You'll be arrested, persecuted. You know, all these things, and of course we over sensualize this thing or sensationalize these things, and we kind of apply it incorrectly to ourselves. But in verse 15, he tells us these are the things that Daniel actually spoke about. And here again, it takes us all the way back to the prophets, which is it is the secret to understanding the harmony between the Old Testament and New Testament. The prophets give us the insight. And I argue that Daniel gives us the most helpful insight because he shows us essentially what has happened between the testaments so we can understand how the two are actually supposed to be read together, right? And rather than separated into two different books almost. Jesus talks about enduring to the end and then preaching the kingdom of God throughout the whole world. I hear people all the time talking about their mandate to preach the Bible and the message about Jesus everywhere. And again, great idea, but please understand that Jesus wasn't expecting you to do what he's saying here. He was talking about his apostles. And again, I'll just keep reading a little bit. All right, so we see those kinds of things happening. And again, one of the things I learned a few years ago, and it has proven to be true, it is very hard to read the Bible in a disciplined manner. When you think about your theological and biblical interpretive mechanisms, or how you approach the Bible, I want you to figure out and determine if you read the Bible the same way across all passages, right? Because if you don't, then the Bible is going to become very inconsistent to you, right? If you do, you're going to discover that the Bible is not trying to build you as many applications and principles as you might think, even though it does do that in time as you read it contextually and historically. But you'll understand that the Bible is not speaking to you as much as it is helping you to understand things about how your life should be governed based on what Christ has already done, right? And so, but we see all these things happening. We hear it all the time, Another thing we see is Jesus talking about false messiahs coming along, all these different things, sun being turned. And this is where we get into what is called eschatology. People have different eschatological views, and people just agree to disagree because, again, when you read the Bible loosely, you can make it say whatever you want it to say, and then many times it sounds good. It sounds like it makes sense. But that doesn't mean that it's right. And what we've unfortunately concluded is that every eschatological position sounds good, so maybe it might be good, and we just agree to disagree. I think that's dangerous, and I think we should be a little bit more careful than that. We should all figure out what is the proper way to read the Bible and identify that way and then go read it, right? And many of the differences about eschatology is centered around the fact that we have far too many unique approaches to reading the Bible. And while we agree on how to read most of the Bible, when it gets down to this eschatology part, we kind of disagree on how to read the Bible, and then we come up with different ideas. But when we see this, you talk about the Son of Man coming, all these different things. Verse 30, Son of Man is coming, will appear in heavens and deep mourning, and there'll be a blast of the trumpet. All of this is Daniel. I mean, the reason he's reading this is not to give you a somewhat of a physical or literal description of what will happen. And again, this is where the technical way in which we read the Bible is more evident in these kinds of passages. Because I've heard people say, well, Jesus doesn't mean that literally. It's all symbolic, it's all allegorical, whatever the case is, and so they read the whole thing allegorically. Well, you can't do that because you'll find yourself, reading that which is to be taken literally, allegorically, and then it doesn't make sense. And then people will say, well, everything is literal, so then you want to read the entire thing literally, and then you can't do that either because this is apocalyptic language, and some of this is imagery, and some of it is symbolic, and some of it is allegorical. And you just got to be able to discern really when Jesus is bouncing from one or the other. That's what it gets down to. And the best way of doing that is being familiar with the Old Testament prophets. Because what he is doing is using, firstly, what they wrote. And then secondly, he's speaking the way they spoke. And they would often speak in one breath literally, and another breath symbolically, and another breath allegorically, and another breath, they would be quoting another writing from someone else. Jesus embodies all those characteristics in this teaching. And so he talks about the clouds and the moon being darkened, and the stars falling from the sky. He does all of that. And then in the very same breath, he comes and says that this generation will not pass from the scene until all these things take place. And we have all kinds of thoughts on that. But the reality is, he did not give us a specific time, but he did give them the time frame. And he told them that all these things would happen in their generation. Now, how do we know he was telling the truth? Well, there's one thing we know did happen in his generation. And historically speaking, there's enough evidence for that to know that it actually happened. And in that generation, just as Jesus predicted, the temple of Jerusalem was destroyed. And Jerusalem, the city, was destroyed in AD 70. All right, or 70 AD. Now, here's the thing. If that happened according to Jesus's prophetic declaration in the Olivet Discourse, and he said to us in verse 34, all these things shall take place before this generation passes, why might we assume that one of these things happened, but the others didn't? You see what I mean here? This is the sort of stuff that I read and I cannot just gloss over. And unfortunately, we make every excuse to rationalize why it would be anything other than what Jesus just said it would be. All right. So with that being said, we really got to pay attention. Now, let's go on to the rest of this, chapter 25. We talk about the kingdom depicted in a few ways here. The first way that it is depicted is as 10 bridesmaids going to a wedding, if you will. 5 foolish, 5 wise, 5 prepared, 5 not. And essentially that's what the kingdom is like. It's like people who are going to inherit something or experience something, but they're not prepared for it, right? And when they get there, they discover that they're not prepared for it, so they try to leave to go become prepared, and by the time they come back, they miss their opportunity. Jesus is saying that's how the kingdom will be. It's going to be like people who come to a wedding festival, if you will, or feast, a bridegroom, to meet and this is important because what bridesmaids, their roles were different back then than they are now. You know, bridesmaids now, they just kind of get dressed up and march down the aisle, which is great. But bridesmaids in this time would light the trails. Like they would stand and light the entryway for the bridegroom, right? And it shows their level of, yes, participation, but it shows their level of responsibility. And part of that meant being prepared for that entry. And there were 5 people, 5 bridesmaids who were prepared, and the others were not. And you understand that the ones who were prepared, they were able to participate in the wedding. Jesus used this to say, you all need to be prepared for my return because you don't know when it's going to happen. And he's speaking to the same people he was speaking to in chapter 24. All right. So that's one depiction. The second depiction is the parable of the 3 servants. And Jesus gave these individuals money. He gave one person 1 bag, another person 2 bags, another person 5 bags. And they had one responsibility to go and basically double it, which shows us that in the kingdom, Jesus is not simply looking for faithfulness. He's looking for production. What are you producing? What are you bringing back to him from what he has given to you, right? So anything God gives me, he expects me to bring more of it back, okay? That's what the kingdom is about. And I like to call this kingdom stewardship. It's the idea that nothing belongs to you, but everything has been given to you for the purpose of the master. Your job is to steward it well, use it well, and multiply it, okay? And obviously, there are some who don't do this, and what they have is taken from them and given to those who will. Now, this is a kingdom principle. Again, Jesus says in verse 29, to those who use well what they are given, even more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who do nothing, even what little they have will be taken away. Now throw this useless servant into outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So you can understand this in many ways. There are some who have been given responsibility, didn't use it well, didn't manage it well, didn't steward it well. That is going to be taken from them and given to some people who will. Now, imagine if you're living in the first century, you're thinking about a Pharisee or a leading priest or the righteous and all these different things. And God is saying, I'm taking the kingdom away from you, giving it to someone who will steward it better. And it's not like anyone you think would have rights over the kingdom, okay? He's pulling away from those who were, lepers and those who were, known to be notorious sinners. And he's giving them the kingdom because in his mind, what he's saying here is I can trust them to do with it what they need to do with it. You guys are up here holding it up and doing nothing with it. So you can imagine how that would come across. All right. Praise the Lord, Elder Smith. Good to see you tonight. Thank you for joining us. Yeah. All right. So look at this, the final judgment. So the remainder of chapter 25, again, deals with the fact that God is going to judge all people. Okay. Starting with his own people. And that's what makes this whole thing far more interesting. The final judgment, yes, is about God judging all people, but all people includes his people. And we read this in the prophets. And we understand the order in which this will all happen because the prophets talked about this. They talked about the day when God would, yes, judge his people, restore his people, and forgive his people. But then after that, then he would move on to the rest of the nation. Now, this motif is all throughout Scripture. Do y'all remember it? We've been reading all year. What would God do? God will call out his people. Say, guys, what have you all been doing? Stop it. They won't stop. God judges them. How does he judge them? By using other nations. God brings in the other nations, judges them. What do the other nations do? They go too far, right? God's people cry out for help. God delivers them, restores them, forgives them. And then he goes back to the people he called to judge them and to chastise them. And he judges them for going too far and not recognizing that this was all God's plan. This is all God's work. You didn't have a right to take advantage of these people. They're still my people. You crossed the line. Now I got to deal with you. Here's what we're reading in this text. Except the difference is this one is final. Okay? There will not be another moment where Israel will be able to slip back into sin and be forgiven again. No, everybody's going to get their judgment, and God is going to establish his kingdom and rule as he desires, okay? And he's going to make sure his people live in the sort of peace and providence and presence that the Bible speaks of, all right? Now, we have a little bit more to go because now we're going to enter into the parts of the Gospels where Jesus is crucified and hung on that cross. And I pray that we'll be able to grasp the significance of Jesus's death, burial, and resurrection as we read through it. But I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you've had a great time. I hope you're encouraged. I'm looking forward to 2026. Again, we're going to come together. We're going to read, study, and we're going to really identify a few ways in which we can understand what we're reading, and not only understand it, but put it into practice, right? Put it into practice and learn about what it is we're discovering. So I invite you to be a part of that. We want to live this thing. We really want to live it. We don't want to just know it, but we want to actually live the Word of God. So I encourage you to jump in next year. Visit www.selflesschurch.org. And you'll see a register link on the homepage, and you can join us, and we'll be more than happy to learn with you and study with you. All right, until next time, thank you so much for watching. I pray you have a blessed week, and I pray you continue to grow in God's word. Until then, take care. God bless. And remember, live by the word.